pleasure of having Krissie VandeNoord with us today from the beautiful state of Kansas. She is a designer, front-end developer, works on all sorts of really interesting projects, owns her own consultancy, working on some really interesting things. And today she's going to talk about a really interesting topic, which is using WordPress as a headless CMS. And she'll talk more about what that is. So Krissie, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so who here has ever gotten into a fight with WordPress? Like, I mean, this could be anything from like a little tiff, things took longer than you thought it was going to take, or like a knockdown, drag out, you seriously contemplated, or maybe you even did actually edit WordPress core files. So I didn't think that I was going to be alone there. I've been working with WordPress for 10 years and been building websites for longer than that, and I've kind of just learned that I'm going to have a love-hate relationship with the technology and the tools that we use. Some tools are more difficult than others. Internet Explorer. No one misses Internet Explorer. We were not sad to see Internet Explorer go. But we feel differently about WordPress. And one of the best ways I'd like to kind of relive the highs and lows of this technology love-hate is through an app called TimeHop. Are you guys familiar with TimeHop? You basically can look back over your past social media posts and see what was posted on this day in years past. So a couple days ago, this popped up in my TimeHop. And it said, I'm working on displaying WordPress content in Flash. Yeah. So I honestly don't know if I was successful in that endeavor. I don't even remember exactly what this project was for. But it absolutely has to be the first time that I really tried to uncouple WordPress. I don't think I was successful. I think I ended up going a different direction here. But it certainly started a conversation for me. So let's, sorry, let me gather my thoughts. We now have some new tools to use. So instead of Flash, we can all take a moment of silence for Flash, but we now have the REST API, and I personally have gotten to know and use React. Now, I didn't start React with WordPress. My first React project was completely separate from WordPress. It was just totally different. WordPress wouldn't have made sense for that. So that's kind of my background. And how I'm kind of approaching this. And so I also want to just challenge you guys, if you ever, for those of you that maybe work only with WordPress, if you ever have an opportunity to do a project that's non-WordPress, take that opportunity. Take what you learn and bring it back to WordPress. You will be better for the experience, and you will be able to expand WordPress more than you thought possible before. So a lot has happened in 8 years, and now I'm starting to revisit this idea of uncoupling WordPress. So let's talk a little bit about exactly what that means. Gwyneth Paltrow kind of gave this phrase a little bit of traction when she was referring to the end of her marriage, and she said, "We have come to the conclusion that while we love each other very much, we will remain separate." Now that is a really ridiculous way to talk about a divorce, but this is Gwyneth Paltrow, and did we really expect her to not be ridiculous? No, but it's actually a pretty decent way of thinking about WordPress and some other tools that we can use separately from each other, but kind of in connection with each other, and decoupling that. So specifically, let's talk about what is a headless CMS. This is basically, it doesn't have to be just WordPress, it's any content management system where you're using the content management features, but you're defining the front-end views outside of the traditional architecture. So that covers like a wide range of things. So this is probably something that you've not ever done before, and while there are probably a lot of things that we've never done before, that we shouldn't do, this is not one of those things. So let's talk about why we should try to go headless, and what are some of the pros and the things that we can benefit from in taking this approach. Back to the whole Gwyneth Paltrow thing for just a minute. If you don't know Gwyneth Paltrow, she's kind of like a super duper health nut, like of the eat cardboard variety. So the joke on the internet was, once they decoupled, that Chris Martin was free to eat whatever he wanted. And so similarly, with decoupling WordPress, we are now free to do whatever we want. There are no rules to follow. No one is leaning over your shoulder and saying that is not the WordPress way. You can do things however you choose. You also get to define things and make your own interactions. Instead of working with a set of predetermined functions and having to think through what hooks and filters are being applied here, you're just creating all of this yourself. You can also really easily deliver the same data across multiple devices and viewpoints. You can reuse some logic and some methodology for a web app or a website, and it just really creates a really seamless user experience. One of the last things I'm going to talk about here, but one of my favorite things, is that the REST API does not deliver any markup. So you can do whatever you want. You don't have to work within a certain set of containers or a certain kind of classes. You can define your own markup, and because of that, you can really create some incredibly lightweight uses that you're just using the exact data that you need, you're just using the exact markup that you need. So, now that we kind of know why you might want to go headless, we'll talk more specifically about doing that with WordPress. And there are really kind of two approaches that I've seen. The first, and it's the one I've seen most often, is to really kind of do a hybrid type of experience. And that's when you're using the REST API within the context of the theme, and you're able to tap into some things like WordPress routing, and you might be able to use some template features, but you're also using that decoupled methodology where you're using the REST API and being able to define some things yourself at the same time. Now, that's not the approach that I've taken. Like I said, I learned React totally separate from WordPress, and so it made the most sense in my mind to take this next approach, which is really going truly headless. Completely independent of the WordPress front end. You can't tap into WordPress routes. You can't use template functions. It can live in a totally separate directory. It lives in a totally separate server sometimes. It's just 100% separated. That made the most sense to me. In my mind, I did not want to muddy the WordPress code with my React code. I just wanted to leave them separate. So to do this, you kind of have to think a little bit outside of the box in how we typically use WordPress. So I just want to kind of talk through what are some of the main gotchas, things that we take for granted, things that we really need to just make sure we're tying up those loose ends if we're going to go this headless route. So before we get too far into that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my setup and the way I found that works best to do this. So the first thing is that I've got WordPress installed in a subdirectory. I played with this a little bit. I played with it on a different domain. I played with it in a subdomain, and this is what made the most sense, was to use a subdirectory. And then I've got my React.js implemented in the root file so that they're on the same domain, but they're separate. And then I have a headless theme installed. So it's really complicated. I wrote this myself. It's a blank index.php file, it's a blank style.css, and it's a functions file that has just a few lines of code to define a couple of menus, and I'll talk about how I use those in a little bit. But basically, you're just wanting to completely eliminate the normal WordPress front end so that somebody doesn't go there and see a page that also exists somewhere else. So now let's talk about one of the biggest hurdles if you're totally separate is routing. We take WordPress routing for granted so much of the time. It just works. So in a truly decoupled setup, WordPress routing is not going to work. You can't use it. You have to create your own system. And there are definitely a few ways to do this. So the first thing that I did was I wanted to make sure the server knew what to do with the incoming traffic based on the URL. And so I've configured a htaccess file. It looks really similar to a WordPress htaccess file. We're just routing everything through index.html. And then index.html is loading our JavaScript that further defines and tells which content to display based on which path we're at. So I use React Router, since I'm using React, to define these paths. And so I wanted to, you can do this manually. You could go in and you could say route path equals about, and then you could say component equals about. But that doesn't really make sense, because what's the point of a content management system if I have to edit code every time I want to make a new page? So I've chosen to go with a dynamic path here, and that's that colon page. If you're familiar with React or React Router, you would know that. And so then I have to tell my page component what to do with that dynamic path. And so this is how I started using the menus. So I have 2 menus that I've defined in that Headless WordPress theme. And one of them is my main navigation, but then one of them is all of these dynamic pages that I'm wanting to account for from a routing standpoint. I want to have some pages on my site that aren't in my main nav. You could accomplish this some different ways too. You could hit an endpoint for just all of the posts on the site and use that to dynamically go through and create your routes. But I liked having a little bit more control, so I've used this menu system, and it's working really well. So in my pages component, I basically compare the page path to the menu endpoint and find that page ID, and that tells it which kind of content to display in that component. And this is admittedly not a perfect solution. This is kind of my first iteration. I know I'm going to be working on and improving it, but it works really well for getting over that routing hurdle that is probably the biggest hurdle to get over when we're talking about really going headless. The next thing I want to talk about is maintaining a usable dashboard experience. I think a lot about user experience, and I actually think a lot about the people that are going to be maintaining the sites. And I want to make sure that their user experience makes sense. So be aware of who's going to have to manage this site. If you're going to be managing it, then do whatever you want, because you know how it works and you built it. But most often, we're handing that off to somebody else. And so we want to make sure that they're not going to find something in the WordPress dashboard that doesn't make sense for how you've built the site to work. So I would suggest disabling features that are not going to be used. You don't want someone to get to a settings page and think that they're affecting the front end of the site that it doesn't have any bearing. So I've done this by just going in and actually removing the menu items. You will probably also want to disable capabilities, because it takes it out of the menu, but if you went directly to that admin page, you would still be able to do some things. It's not likely somebody's going to land there if it's not in the menu, but let's just dot all our I's and cross all of our T's. The other thing that we need to consider is that not all plugins are going to work as expected. So I would suggest either disabling the plugins once you get them configured how you know that they're going to work, or at least very, very clearly communicating to whoever's managing the site what to expect from a plugin standpoint. There are absolutely plugins that work with the REST API and will work with a decoupled setup like this. And we'll go ahead and talk through what some of those are, but there are significant numbers of them that won't do anything. And depending on how you've built the site, you're going to know which ones will work and which ones won't. So the plugins that I used are Advanced Custom Fields Pro. I'm a big fan of ACF. But what you'll need to do is go ahead and use this ACF to REST API, and that's going to generate those endpoints for you that you can use with the REST API. You could certainly build them yourself, but why do that if someone's already done it for you? I also use the REST API Force SSL, the REST API menus, so that way I could have some endpoints for those menus that I talked about. And then I use Gravity Forms. They're not paying me to say this, but Gravity Forms works really well with the REST API, and you don't even have to install like another plugin to make the API work. And back to the kind of what we talked about earlier with not having markup, this is one of those examples. So instead of, you can actually use Gravity Forms, you can drop it into like your standard content field with a short code, and it will spit it out on the front end headless. That will work. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to create my own form. And so I built a form on the front end in React and mirrored it in the dashboard with a Gravity form and matched the fields. And then when I submit that totally separate React form, I hit the Gravity Forms endpoint and process the response back. And it works really, really well, and it's really fun. So the last thing that I want to make sure that we talk about is SEO. Specifically with React and anything that is being rendered in the client's browser, SEO is just not going to work the same. Now, you can go ahead and render that JavaScript on the server before you deliver it across, but that kind of seemed counterproductive to me. So I kind of wanted to, it was the challenge of, how do I make this work? So Google actually can index a browser-rendered JavaScript page. It's not perfect, but they do it. However, I believe that the other search engines don't do this yet. So Bing, not going to happen. So you just need to have that conversation with your client about what's important. And if they want to make sure that SEO is key and that they want to make sure they're showing up even in Bing, then you're probably going to need to take a different approach, or maybe Headless isn't right quite yet for that client. So if you do want to go ahead and do this, you can use the Google Search Console. And it's going to tell you and show you exactly what the bot is seeing, and then you can make adjustments. So it might be that you need to kind of load a little bit of content a little bit earlier, or I know for me, I had some content that wasn't being brought in until a button was clicked, and then it would kind of like show up on the page. Well, Google didn't see that. So you just want to make sure that you check what your site is seeing in that Search Console, and just make sure that what your users are experiencing or what the bots are experiencing, if SEO is at all a concern. And then also make sure that that subdirectory isn't indexable. I mean, if you've got that Headless theme installed, it shouldn't be, but double check that, because if you've got duplicate content, that's going to be a no-no from an SEO perspective. So a little bit about just going ahead and making the choice to do this. I have to say that going headless is not the right choice for all sites. There are actually very few sites that I would do this with right now. And one of the considerations that I would make is if the client is prepared to do ongoing maintenance. I don't feel quite comfortable with this technology to the point of just handing it over to a client and knowing like I might never see it again. I want to keep my hands on it just a little bit so that I can just really quickly fix the little gotchas that come up. And experiment with it a little bit further. So you'll just have to weigh those odds. But I definitely encourage you to start playing with this. Start using it, because I think in the next few years, we're going to see less and less of those little gotchas. We're going to see more people using this, and it's going to be a really, really nice way to use WordPress and keep that fantastic content management that WordPress is famous for, but really be able to do whatever you want on the front end, and really just kind of step out of your box and experiment with it, play with it. So that is what I've got. You can see these slides over at northuxdesign.com/loopconference, and you can look me up on Twitter at Krissie Ray or northuxdesign. Admittedly, if you go to Krissie Ray, you're going to see a lot of pictures of my kids. So if you want only the business stuff, use northuxdesign.